Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at Latin numbers. So this is a really important idea, and it's something that maybe you've spoken about in class before, maybe you haven't. But the reason I like to talk about Latin numbers with my students is because there always is this question, right, when we start in Latin 1 with my young students, and they say, how come we don't learn about numbers in Latin, right? They always compare, to their classmates who might be taking French or Spanish or Italian or whatever other language they might be doing. And pretty early on in those languages, you learn how to say things like 1, 2, 3, right? So why don't we do that in Latin? Well, the answer is because it's not that simple, right? It's not as easy as just coming up with a word that means 1, 2, or 3. Some of these numbers involve case, number, and gender, which is a tricky idea that we're going to dive into in this video, okay? So the thing you want to remember for Latin numbers is that they're adjectives, right? And some of them have that case, number, and gender, like I just said. Not all of them, but a few of them do. And that's why it's tricky to learn numbers, because if you don't understand case, number, and gender in terms of adjectives, it makes it really hard to understand how these numbers are working in Latin. So for instance, if you want to describe the two puppies right over to the right in this picture, in one of, any other language, Romance languages, you just say 2 and you'd be pretty set and straightforward. In Latin, though, you need to stop and think, how many dogs are there? Are they the subject or the direct object? So in other words, are the 2 dogs doing something, or am I seeing the 2 dogs? And you need to know the gender, right? There's a lot that goes into it, which makes it a little tricky. So the question you want to ask is, where do we start, right? If it's so complicated, what are we supposed to do? Well, it's actually pretty easy. The first thing we want to think about is you have to understand that there's 2 different types of numbers in English and in Latin, right? There's cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers. So we're going to look at each one to understand what they mean. So the first we're going to look at are the cardinal numbers. So cardinal numbers are the numbers we use when we're counting, right? So just in general, they are the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they generally answer the question, how many, or quote in Latin, right? So if you were to say, how many dogs are there? You could say there's 7 dogs, right? 7 would be a cardinal number. Okay, and that's different from an ordinal number we're going to see in a little bit, which has to do with the order of things like first, second, or third. So when we're dealing with cardinal numbers, this is what they look like in Latin, right? And the numbers 1, 2, and 3 are the tricky ones because they involve gender, which makes them complicated. So right off the bat, you can see that they have 3 different endings. So the number 1 can be spelled either unus, a, and it depends on if you're talking about a masculine, feminine, or a neuter object. Okay, but in general, the number 1 is unus, number 2 is duo, and number 3 is tres. For the rest of them, there is no gender involved, right? So there's only one way to say it. It doesn't matter the case, anything like that. The number 4 will always be quatuor. Then we have quinque for 5, sex for 6, septem for 7, octo for 8, noem for 9, and decem for 10. So the last 4 might look kind of familiar. Our months of the year, right? September, October, November, December. They come from these numbers. So originally when you had 10 months, September would have been the 7th month, right? And October would have been the 8th month. Now they don't line up because we added 2 more months in with July and August, which are named for Julius Caesar and Augustus, right? So once you added the 2, it shifted everything by 2. So the 7th month, right, September, became really the 9th month and down the line. But you can actually still see the numbers in these English names for the last 4 months of the year. Okay, so like we said, some of these numbers have case, number, gender, and the numbers 1, 2, and 3 are the main culprits. There's also the number 500, which you probably won't run into too much in your Latin career, but 1, 2, and 3 are pretty basic, and this is why we don't teach you Latin numbers right off the bat. I mean, I guess you could, but it's pretty difficult to do until you have some Latin under your belt, because it depends on what you're trying to say. So for instance, if you're trying to say, I see 1 dog, right? That would be a direct object. We wouldn't spell it unus if the dog is masculine, right? You'd say unum. You'd have to make it accusative. And the same thing, if you're saying, oh, I see 2 buildings, duo, that's different from saying, I see 2 girls, duos rather, right? So the gender really plays into these first 3 numbers, which makes them tricky. So you can take a look. A lot of textbooks have the different endings for the numbers 1, 2, and 3, and 500 as well. But those are ones you just kind of need to memorize, or more often than not, I'll always tell you, read it in context, right? If you see something that clearly looks like a number and it starts with un, right, un, and then it has some weird ending on it, you can probably take a guess that it just means 1. So the memorization part, stick with whatever you're doing in class. I think the best way to do it is just through context and reading. But you're going to realize that numbers 1, 2, and 3, they have to agree, and 500, I keep skipping 500, they have to agree with the noun they're going with. So whatever the case, number, and gender of your noun is, that's what it's going to be for the adjective, or the number in this case as well. Okay, so just keep that in mind. For the rest of them, though, you can actually see Romance languages connections, right? Or connections to the Romance languages, I should say, in these numbers, right? The first 10. And just to give you an example here, I gave you Spanish and French. And if you look from left to right at the Latin and then the Spanish and French, you're going to see how they're all related to each other. Right? They look similar. They're all, coming from this Latin root. So the numbers are actually a really good way to see how Latin will help you if you ever decide to continue on and learn a Romance language, which I highly recommend you do. Or maybe you already speak one of these and now you can kind of, backpedal and see where these words came from, right? But the numbers are pretty consistent in the Romance languages, which makes it a little easier to understand. Like I said, if you ever want to go learn Spanish or French or Italian, you'll kind of have a leg up from knowing Latin. Here's the next 10 numbers, right? So we have 11 through 20. Now, the interesting thing here is when you say 11, for instance, in Latin, you say undecim. Now, this should look kind of interesting to you, right? Because the decim part is coming from decem, which means 10. So when you do these numbers, what you're really doing on numbers 11 through 20 is either a little bit of addition or a little bit of subtraction. And let me show you what I mean by color coding them, right? So in the number 11, well, actually 11 through 17, they all end in decim, which means 10. So it's all a reference to 10 of something. When you say undecim, you're adding 1, and 10. That's 11. Duodecim is 2 and 10, or 12. 13 is tridecim, which is 3 and 10. And you can keep going with 14, 15, 16, 17, right? They're all adding to the number 10. Right? When you get to numbers 18, 19, and 20, though, you actually do subtraction. So the number 20 is viginti in Latin. So when you go to 18, you would say duo de viginti, which is literally 2, duo, from 20, de viginti, right? 2 from 20, or 2 subtracted from 20 is 18. And the same thing is happening with the number 19, unde viginti, 1 from 20. So there's an interesting little bit of addition and subtraction happening here. And it really stems from whatever your main number is, really the multiple of 10 in this case. So you're either counting from 10 or you're counting backwards from 20. And again, if you're curious about how this all plays out, you can look at the Romance languages again. They do something very similar. So when you look at particularly the numbers 17, 18, 19, you can really see how they're coming from Latin, right? In Spanish and French, you're adding to the number 10, and they actually don't do the subtraction bit. So you can see in the French, for instance, 17 is 10 plus 7, and then 10 plus 8, and 10 plus 9, right? Same thing happening with Spanish. They're doing the addition, though. So the idea of adding or subtracting a number from sort of a main number continues on into the Romance languages. So again, if you can understand this idea that in Latin you're really saying 10 plus something or 20 minus something, it'll help you understand the other Romance languages, which is useful, right? It's something you should be doing. Now, for the rest of them, these are the multiples of 10, which will help you kind of understand what's going on. And the way you would count is exactly the same way, but instead of counting from 10, you could do 30, right? Start with triginta, or if you want to do the 40s, you have quadraginta. But again, they're all kind of the similar idea. They have ginta at the end of it, and the number in front, tri, quad, quin, that's your 30, 40, 50, right, idea. And you can see how they're all related to each other. When you get to 100, that's where you get centum, which is a good word to know. A lot of people recognize it from the English word century, which means 100 of something, or centennial, right? When you get to 500, we saw quingenti, rather. Yikes, tripping over that one. Quingenti is one of these numbers that has masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. So again, that's something to just keep in mind. And then you have 1,000, mille, right, which is where you get, for instance, millennium from, 1,000 years. But you can kind of see how if you take these pieces, you can add and get any number you want, right? So if you want to just say 31, put 1 in front of 30 and you're off and running. Or you could subtract backwards if you're doing like 88, for instance, okay? So this will set you up to understand the numbers. And again, the best way to do this is through practice. But like we said, the numbers 1, 2, 3, they're tricky because they have case number and gender, right? So they have to match the case number and gender of the noun that they're going with. All the other numbers are set. So like, for instance, the number 4, quattuor, will always be spelled 4, and you don't have to think about it. But since we were referencing these numbers, I think it's important to just take a couple examples and see how this plays out. So if I gave you, for instance, unam sororem Marcus habet, I'm saying Marcus has one sister. Because sister is feminine accusative singular, I had to use the feminine accusative singular form of one, which would be unam. That's different from saying unum fratrem Cornelia habet, because now I'm saying Cornelia has one brother. I changed it from a sister to a brother, and now I need the masculine form with the number one. So it went from unam with an am to unum with a um. That's because it needed to be masculine. And if you want to put in a neuter there, if you said tria edificia Marcus vide, you're saying Marcus sees 3 buildings. Now I'm using a neuter accusative plural ending. Okay? So the numbers 1, 2, and 3, you're probably going to get them correct every time just by practice. You can go look up a chart. Like I said, it'll help you. But if you just recognize that you're dealing with the number 3, you're probably going to catch on that it's matching the noun that it's going with without too much issue. But in general, when you're dealing with the numbers 1, 2, and 3, just make sure that it's matching the noun in case, number, gender, and you'll be fine. So hopefully this is making a little bit of sense, right? Cardinal numbers, we're counting something. But now we're going to throw into the mix ordinal numbers, right? So another type of number. So before you freak out, don't worry. It's pretty straightforward. It's going to sound exactly like it sounds, right? It's going to function exactly like it sounds, rather. Ordinal numbers are about ordering something, okay? So just like the name implies, you're saying whether something is first, second, third, fourth, fifth. You're giving the order of it. This is what we call ordinal numbers. And because they have a different function, they're actually spelled differently, which makes sense. We do the same thing in English, right? The number 1 is different from saying first, for example. Okay, so these are the ordinal numbers. For first, we have primus, right? Primus aum. Second is secundus aum. Then we have tertius, quartus, quintus, sextus, septimus, octavus, nonus, and decimus, right? So if we look at these pretty closely, something should stand out to you for being different about the ordinal numbers. And the thing that stands out is they're using first and second declension adjective endings. So in other words, they're using us aum endings. Whereas before, when we were talking about just cardinal numbers, the numbers 4 through 10 didn't have any endings at all, right? And even the numbers 1, 2, and 3 didn't quite look like this. So ordinal numbers are actually pretty straightforward because they're using these fairly straightforward and simple endings, just first and second declension us aum adjective endings, okay? So just keep that in mind. But since they do use these endings, again, when you use ordinal numbers, they have to match in case, number, and gender. So these are a little different. With cardinals, like we said, the number 10 will always be decem, right? So 10 of whatever, it doesn't matter. But when you're saying first, it depends on what you're describing. So the first boy will be different from the first girl, which will be different from the first building, right? So you need to keep that case, number, and gender in mind. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. Here's the rest of them. If you go 11th through 20th, you have undecimus, duodecimus, and down the line. And you'll notice that they're all starting, at least number the order 11th through 17th. You have decimus, 10, right? 10th, rather. And they're putting a number in front of it. So undecimus is 1 plus 10th, which is 11th, right? And duodecimus is 2 plus 10th, or 12th. It's doing the exact same thing as cardinal numbers. So this should be pretty straightforward to understand. 18 and 19, same thing. You're subtracting from 20th, which is vicesimus. So duode vicesimus, 18th, is literally 2 from 20th, which would give you 18th. And 19th is unde vicesimus, which is 1 from 20th, or 19th, okay? So they follow similar patterns, the cardinal and the ordinals. They just look different, right? So they're spelled different, and ordinal numbers have that case, number, and gender for all of them. They're all us aum adjectives, okay? Here's some more that you might run into. 50th, right? Quinquagesimus. 100th is centesimus. Then you have 500th and 1000th, okay? So you can count the order of whatever you want, right? These are pretty straightforward. When you run into them, it's not too difficult to work with them because they have pretty straightforward endings, right? Us aum endings. So if you were to compare the two, these are your cardinal versus your ordinal numbers. Again, cardinal numbers are for counting. Most don't have case, number, or gender, except the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 500 do. And they're really answering the question, how many, right? How many of this do I have? Oh, I have 10. I have 15. I have 25. Those are cardinal numbers. Ordinal numbers, on the other hand, are for listing the order of things. First, second, third, fourth, fifth. Okay, they all use those first and second declension us aum adjective endings, and they're really answering the question what, right? So you might say, what child are you? Oh, I'm the 5th child, right? You're giving the order. It is how these work. Okay, so they're fulfilling and doing a different function than the cardinal numbers. If you were to look at all of them together, this chart brings it all together, right? The numbers 1 through 20. It gives you the cardinals on the left and the ordinals on the right, just so you can compare them and see how similar they are, because they're basically using the same stem and then just doing slightly different things as you go. okay? But this would be a good spot if you want to pause the video. I know it's a little small. Pause the video, take a look, and you'll be able to see the connections between them. But now that we've covered them, we want to do some examples just so you can see them in context, because like I said, it's much easier to understand these by translating than memorizing a chart. Okay, so if you saw this sentence, puellae septem horas dormiveran, you're saying the girls slept for 7 hours. Septem is describing horas. It's the accusative duration of time, right? 7 does not have case number and gender, so it's just septem. You're not changing anything about it. It's going with horas. You're saying for 7 hours. Very straightforward. Here, though, I'm using an ordinal, tertia, right? So if you say quota ora est tertia ora, you're saying what hour is it, right? It's the 3rd hour. I'm giving the order of the hour. So tertius aum needs to match with ora. In this case, they're both feminine, nominative, singular. So they both have the a ending. Tertia and ora are going together, right? Tertia is describing ora. So here's an example where case number and gender does matter because I'm using an ordinal. And lastly, you have unum fratrem Cornelia habet. So Cornelia has one brother, right? Unum fratrem. This is the example I gave you before. One, unum, has to use case number and gender. Even though it's a cardinal number, 1, 2, and 3 still have that case number and gender. It's describing fratrem. They're both masculine accusatives, right? Accusative singular. So they're going to match each other, right? The reason they don't have the same ending is unum is using that 1st and 2nd declension ending, and frater is a 3rd declension noun. But they both match in terms of case number gender, even though the spelling is slightly different. Okay? So now that we've seen all of it, a pro tip for you, I've said this a lot of times, find something that helps you like memorize these. And sometimes the silliest song you can find sticks in your brain, which to me would be High Paws. And again, I don't know High Paws, just a big fan. But he has a video of Latin numbers, which might help you out. Your brain is always wired for music. So feel free to take a look if that helps you. The bonus pro tip is always Magistrula, right? Like I said, you could memorize all the charts you want, but the only skill you're really testing there is your ability to memorize. It's much better to read and translate actual Latin. So if you want to take Magistrula and just rattle off a bunch of sentences, it will mix numbers in. If I remember correctly, there's not a setting to actually, specifically put numbers, but there'll be a bunch in there. So the more you read, the more you practice, the more you can see these numbers in context, the better off you're going to feel about it. You'll just feel much more comfortable with the cardinals and the ordinals. Okay? So now let's just do a quick recap to end the video. So for Latin numbers, we talked about how there's 2 different types, cardinal and ordinal. The cardinal numbers are for counting. So it's basically 1, 2, and 3, right? And so on in English. The ordinal numbers are telling you the order of something. So 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and down the line. The cardinal numbers do not have case number and gender except for the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 500, which is why you probably didn't learn Latin numbers at the beginning of your Latin career because they're a little tricky. The ordinals do have that case and gender, right? So they're using 1st and 2nd declension, us, adjective endings. So they're doing different things, cardinals and ordinals, and they actually look different. But either way, your best bet, and I know I said this, but I'll say it again, your best bet is to read as much Latin as you can, whether it's a textbook or just stories or Magistrula. Try to read, and the more you see these numbers in context, the better off you're going to feel. If you have any questions at all, again, feel free to put a comment down below. I'll try to help you however I can. Hopefully the video made some sense to you, and you're ready to take on Latin numbers whenever you see them. But practice, and you'll be fine. Good luck.